Hello again, fellow audiophiles. I am Wave Theory, and here, as promised, I am back to do an in-depth comparison video of the Violectric HPA V324 amplifier and the Violectric HPA V281 amplifier. The HPA V281 that I have is an original, a design going back to about 2015. If you're wanting to buy an HPA V281 here in 2025, though, you've got to get the new limited edition, which is the same amplifier with some cosmetic changes, a couple of feature changes, but is otherwise the same amplifier circuit. The V324 is Violectric's most recent brand new model in there, and it has these nice fancy VU meters on it there as well. Both units retail for $2,800 US, and so that is like a natural question then becomes, which one of these should you buy and why? And that is what we are going to look at in this bonus video here on Reviews by Wave Theory. So stick around right after shameless self-promotion to hear my explanations of that.
Hi, it's me again, 14 months later and a whole foot taller. Now, since Wave Theory liked the first 10,000 subscriber play button I made him, maybe he wants a 25,000 subscriber play button. This can only happen if you subscribe though. Now, since over 60% of the watch time comes from unsubscribed viewers, I'm gonna need you to subscribe. You can also sign up for his Patreon or send him money in PayPal. Links in the description. Now, on to the video.
This video is basically a part 2 of my HPA V324 review, which just dropped the day before this video released. So, if you have not watched my full review of the V324, go back and watch that. But why is this video here separately? Well, again, because of the natural comparison that comes up between these two amplifiers here, I'm really going to go into depth because they are the same price, they are from the same maker, they kind of are from different times though, but the presence of the V281 LE definitely makes this an interesting and worthwhile comparison to make as a bonus video here. So that's why we're doing it separately, and I'm going to go into much more depth about the comparison in this video than I did in the review video of the V324. So here we go. All right, so I already talked about this in the main video, but just to kind of run through it again, you can see from a few differences from the front panels. Now, the V281 LE is a little bit different again and has the same headphone output complement that the V324 does now, okay? But there are other similarities, like this push button matrix here to determine the input and output selection on the V281 has turned into multi-position dip switches here, not dip switches, rocker switches. Are these rockers? Multi-position switches here on the front panel of the V324. All right, also the V324 has these nice, really cool looking and dimmable backlight on these VU meters there, which is pretty cool. Another key difference here is that you get the pre-gain control on the front panel of the V324, whereas on the V281, it's a bank of dip switches on the back panel, which can be a bit of a pain in the butt if ever you need to change the gain. All right, another difference here is you see on the 281, there is a knob here on the front panel for balance control, and there is no such control on either the front or the back of the V324, so don't have differential hearing loss between your two ears. All right, now, other than that, I mean, you can definitely tell that they are sibling units. They are from the same maker and all that, with the volume knob nice and prominent right in the front panel there. Like the V281, I don't know what the LE has, but the original had the option of getting a 256 step attenuator in it, which this unit has, and it has that clicky sounding volume control, which doesn't do when it's not powered on, okay? But it's got clicky volume control on it there, whereas with the V324, it is this nice smooth turn. I believe it's an Alps RK47, RK27, excuse me, a potentiometer attached to that. It is nice, smooth turning here. On the subject of volume control and also related to the gain, I have found that even though the V281 has this 256 step attenuator in it, I think you can get more fine-grained volume control out of the V324. And why is that? Well, The gain stages here on the V324 seem to occupy narrower ranges of possible output levels than the gain stages on the V281 do, right? So I found that, like, with the V281, I rarely, with very rare exception, do I ever really need to change it away from its like 0 dB gain setting. I can just leave that there and I get enough volume range where I can drive pretty much any headphone that I want, even some very difficult headphones like the Susvara, which sure, maybe my potentiometer is like way up here near maxed out, but I'm still getting plenty of output level, and rarely did I ever feel the need to really boost the gain on this. The only time I can really ever remember needing to do that was with the Modhouse Tungsten when that was in for review, and the V281 powered that headphone beautifully. Okay, unfortunately, I don't have a tungsten in to compare here on the V324. But with the V324, what I found is that with a lot of headphone loads here, I really did need to change the gain setting to get the output level that I was looking for, both in terms of loudness, but also in terms of background noise too. Like if I want to drive Susvara, I found that I needed to put this really on plus 12 and run this around like 1, 2 o'clock, somewhere in there. Maybe it wasn't quite that loud, but I needed to push it that high, where again I didn't necessarily have to change the gain here. But if I plug in my Focal Radiance, which is a low impedance dynamic driver headphone, then anything above 0 in the dB setting here was one, getting way too loud, way too fast, but also I could hear the noise floor creeping in there. So I often would actually back this down to -6 when I plugged in something like the Radiance there, because I could hear the noise floor coming through in a way that I don't really recognize here on the V281 there. So it's nice that the gain control is on the front, and I think that is important because, again, I found with the range of headphones that I was testing with, I needed to adjust the gain more on the 324 than I did the V281. But I do also think that's a good thing because it gives you more fine-grained control on the output level in there. So that's actually nice, I think. Otherwise, a lot of their base features are the same. The inputs and outputs on the back panel are basically identical. They're moved around where they are on the back panel, but who cares? It's the same complement of things back there and so forth. All right, the other difference, and I showed this in the first video, but I can put it here again, is that the V281 is the deeper unit here. There's several inches or centimeters here of overhang in the depth here that the V281 has that the 324 does not. So the V324 has that smaller footprint, which makes it a little bit more desktop placement friendly, I think, for more people in more situations there. Okay. Now let's get to the meat of the comparison, which is what you're really interested in, and that is in the sound. To do a deep dive comparison on these, I used a wide array of headphones here. And so what I did is I got out my Cord Hugo 2 with its mated 2-go streamer to use as a source as a Roon endpoint and DAC. Okay, and I set its volume up fairly high, and then I got one of those little P&W RCA to 4.4 millimeter Penacon adapters, and then ran an adapter Y cable that was 4.4 millimeter Penacon on one end, and then dual 3-pin XLR on the other into the balanced outputs of these things, and literally just pulled the cable out of the back panel of one of these amps and moved it to the other when I wanted to switch back and forth between headphones. What I found here is as headphone amplifiers, because as preamps, they're basically the same thing. There's not a ton of imparted signature or anything like that. They both work very well as preamplifiers. That's a strength of the Lake People brand here when they have that option. So I'm going to talk about these comparisons here as headphone amplifiers. And I used a wide range of actual headphones, not IEMs. I'm not one of those people that plugs IEMs into desktop amps. You can be if you want, but that's not me, so we're going to talk headphones here. And I made sure that I checked multiple headphones in all of these main categories. Those categories being low impedance dynamic driver headphones, high impedance dynamic driver headphones, low impedance / easy to drive planar magnetic headphones, and then then difficult driving planar magnetic headphones, all those so all the four major categories here. The individual models I will talk about here when we get to the actual deep dive on the comparisons here. But those are the major categories. And what I found through this here, and that I will unpack in more detail as the video progresses, is that there's a clear winner in two of the categories, and then it gets a lot tighter and less clear in the other two categories. All right, and what I mean by that is if you want to drive difficult driving planar magnetic headphones like HiFiMan's Susvara, okay, as the key example, or like the HE6 series, okay, Abyss headphones would fall into this category, okay, those types of things, even the Dan Clark E3 and certainly the Stealth and the Expanse, which are more difficult driving planars. The V324 is clearly the better of these two at that. Okay, so that's something to keep in mind, and I'll have more to say about that here in a moment. The other big, clear victory for one of these two amps here is when you get into high impedance dynamic driver headphones. Those 250 ohm or 600 ohm Bayer Dynamics, the 300 ohm Sennheisers and ZMFs, the 400 some ohm Audio Technicas that are out there. Those kinds of things, the V281 is clearly the better of these two amps still. That was the strength of the V281 when it was made back in 2015, is that high Z category. And that remains true here. It is clearly the better of these two for those particular kinds of headphones. All right, where it gets a little bit fuzzier is when you get into the easier driving stuff, because for easier driving planar headphones, okay, like most of HiFiMan's HE1000 series, most of Audeze LCD series, like the LCDX, the LCD5, okay, those kinds of things in there. Like, you get into those kinds of headphones, you can put the Mezes in this category too, since those are generally easier to drive as well. You get into that category, and it's very tight. Right? And I don't have a ton of those. I've got a couple of the HE1000s in, and I don't want to go into too much of the depth right now, but I lean slightly towards the V324 there personally, but it's very much going to be a personal preference here. To me, there's not a clear victor between these two in that category. All right, easy driving dynamic headphones. Okay, this is a lot of them. We're talking dynamic drivers, 50 ohms or less of impedance, generally speaking, and fairly high sensitivities. It's a toss-up. It's a toss-up. Okay, so let's peel all of this back here. Let me tell you the models that I use to determine all of these, and what I heard, okay, and why I'm saying these. All right, so let's start with a high or difficult driving planar magnetic loads. On hand to test those between these two, I had the OG HiFiMan Susvara, which you actually see right back there. I have I used the Dan Clark E3 headphone, which is not particularly easy to drive as a planar. And then I also got out the SJY Horizon Closed Carbon. I still have that one around. And that one is not particularly difficult to drive in terms of number of ohms, because it's only an 11 or 13 ohm headphone, something like that. But it's low-ish in sensitivity, and so it's current hungry, right? I talked to Jeffrey, the owner and founder of SJY Audio at CanJam SoCal, and I was talking to him about his Horizon Closed Carbon, and he goes, oh yeah, it needs all the current, okay? Which is true. It does, all right? So I got that out here. And as I've already said, the V324 was the easily superior of these two amps on that kind of headphone load. It was cleaner, it was clearer, there was more control to the sound overall. It was less sibilant, less sharp, okay, that smoother in both its tone and in its presentation, more refined in there. It also is more three-dimensional and holographic, and I think because it was just cleaner and clearer generally and more holographic, there was also a greater sense of resolution and detail retrieval in there. Now, The 281 is certainly no slouch up in that with those kinds of headphones. It still sounds pretty good and it's definitely workable. The V281 always sounds a little bit slammier to me than the V324 does, and its low end always sounds a little bit more rounded. It's also the slightly warmer in overall tone between these two. But it's never as controlled or as clean or as clear or as resolving or as detailed as the V324 is, hey, on those things. And the 324 still brings a decent amount of dynamism, physicality, and impact to the sound, all that. So on balance, the V324 is clearly the better option, I think, for difficult driving planar magnetic loads. All right. But as I mentioned earlier, the V281 is easily the better option of these two for high impedance dynamic driver headphones. Okay. And so like what I had on hand to test those with would be the Beyerdynamic DT880 600 ohm. That I had in for review recently and is able to check this. I had the brand new Audio-Technica ATH ADX 7000, which is a 490 ohm headphone in there. So that's a new flagship high impedance dynamic driver there. I also have in the Massdrop Sennheiser HD6XX, which is 300 ohms. All right, and there was one other, yes, the original Focal Utopia I am going to put into this category as well here, and it is kind of a high impedance dynamic driver because its nominal impedance is 80 ohms, but around the driver's resonant frequency, it spikes to a little over 290 ohms, so it has a lot of high impedance-like characteristics to it. With all of those headphones, I definitely preferred the V281, and I thought the situation was kind of reversed on this one, where the V281 sounded cleaner, clearer, tighter in its overall sound, a little bit more resolving, a little bit more three-dimensional and holographic. You still had the greater impact from the V281 too, because it is just the more physical and impactful of these two amplifiers generally, and it has the more rounded, fuller low end to it, okay, than the V324 does. But all those other technicals that I just mentioned there, I preferred the sound of all of those things from the V281 through those high impedance dynamic driver loads there. And the gap in performance here was basically the same for either category in the favor of either amp. So what I mean is, it's like, as much improvement as the 324 gave over the V281 for the for the difficult driving planars, the V281 gives you basically the same level of improvement over the V324 in terms of high impedance dynamic driver headphones. And the other interesting thing that I noted here about those two categories, those two main categories there, is the further extreme you get in either direction, the bigger that performance gap between the two amplifiers gets. Like the Susvara, to my ear, was very, very clearly better on the 324 than it was on the V281. But likewise, the DT880 at 600 ohms was very, very clearly better on the V281 than it was on the V324. Something like the Utopia was very close, leaning V281 for me, but was very close in overall comparison, or overall performance, these two compared there. Very close, right? But you get a little bit further out in there, like the SJY Horizon Closed Carbon was, better on the 324. Actually, that one, because it's so current hungry, I should say, was much better on the 324. It was, because I could hear that the V281 did not have the current output for the Horizon Closed Carbon. So bass hits got distorted and splashy sounding and that sort of thing, where they were nice and clean through the V324. What I should have said is with the Dan Clark E3, which is a moderately difficult to drive planar, I had a slight leaning towards the 324 over the V281. Not a huge difference there. So that just comes back to the point where the more extreme you get in either direction of difficult driving planar or high impedance dynamic, okay, the bigger the gap gets in the respective category where each amp wins. Now, the natural question that someone is going to ask here, and I unfortunately don't have the answer for it, is what about something like the Modhouse Tungsten, which is both high impedance but also planar magnetic? And I know the V281 drives that headphone really well. And when I reviewed the Tungsten, the V281 was my favorite amp of the amps that I had on hand at the time to run that headphone with. How does the V324 do? I unfortunately don't know because I was never able to hear that comparison or that combination. I will say though that giving Violectric like people the benefit of the doubt here just based on their reputation and like the comparative performance on how well these things drive it, my best guess is it's going to fall into the category of the Tungsten is going to sound very good from both of these, and it's just going to end up being kind of within the preference range as to which you prefer. Probably, okay? But please, like, take that I'm hedging a little bit here because I have not been able to directly hear that combination. All right, now, on to the categories where the winner between these two Vios here is less clear. Easy-Driving Planar magnetic headphones. And on hand, the Easy-Driving Planars that I have right now that I was able to do this with are mostly hi-fi mids. You see the HE1000 unveiled over my shoulder here, so that was one of them. The HE1000 SE being two examples here. I don't have them on hand right now, but, you know, other Easy-Driving Planars, I've already mentioned this, would be things like LCD-X, LCD-5, Meze Empyrean series, Meze Elite, those kinds of things there, right? All right. Now, I have personally, with the HE1000s anyway, a very narrow preference for the V324. Okay, both of these do a really good job with the Heck Unveiled there and the HE1000 SE. So both of those headphones sound really great through these amps. It's going to be in the personal preference range, I think, where people land on individual Easy-Driving Planars with both of these headphones, but they both can handle that kind of load pretty well. Okay, so again, as long as it's not something extreme like the SJY Horizon Closed Carbon, which is low in impedance, but also low in sensitivity, so it draws a ton of current. Okay, as long as you're not doing something like that, you basically you're going to be fine with either amp. And it's just going to come down to which of the sound signatures of these amps do you prefer, and like, you know, what are your personal preferences there? Do you like the warmer, slightly more impactful, and more rounded low end sound of the V324, or do you like the cleaner, slightly clearer, overall more controlled sounding sound of the V324? Okay, I can't answer that for you. That's going to be a question that you have to answer, but you can sleep comfortably regardless of which amplifier you get, knowing here that it's going to drive that kind of load just fine. All right. Now, results got very interesting for me when I looked at low impedance dynamic driver headphones. And there's a bunch of those out there on the market right now. I had 4 units in particular that I compared these two amps with here in-house with the low impedance dynamic driver loads. And they're all from different manufacturers, which is nice. One of them is the Head D1, which I just did a review for. The other one is the Murph Designs Murph 1, which I also recently did a review for. Another is the Focal Radiance, which is one of my longtime personal favorite headphones. And then the last one is one that I have not quite reviewed yet, but the review should be out in the near future. And that is of the HFA Dahlia, or the Hi-Fi for All Dahlia there. And all of those headphones kind of fall in like that $700 to like $1,000 category anymore. 3 of them are open back. The Radiance is a closed back, but they're all like 50 ohms and less of impedance with generally high sensitivity and are fairly easy to drive. And I preferred 2 of them on the V324, and I preferred the other 2 on the V281. On the 324, I liked the D1 and the Radiance. Okay, why? Well, because those 2 headphones, for whatever reason, probably because they are the warmest tuned of that group there. The cleanliness, the clarity, the overall cleaner sound, the slightly more neutral sound signature of the V324, I think jived with them a little bit more than what the V281 did. Also, in the case of the D1 in particular, and I'm not sure why this is, the D1 just did not react well to the 281. There was like some sharpness and shrillness and sibilance in the treble that the D1 does not normally have. That was just a bad synergistic pairing for reasons I don't understand. It did not anticipate there, because I know the D1 is an excellent headphone. I know the V281 is an excellent amp. Sometimes you just get those pairings in there that just don't work very well. And for whatever reason, the 281 and the D1 was such a pairing. But the 324 and the D1 sounded great. Okay, so I don't know what was going on with that. All right, but then that leaves the Dahlia and the Murph 1 that I preferred from the V281. And I think, again, that's because the Dahlia in particular and the Murph 1 to a lesser degree are a little bit closer to true neutral. The Dahlia in particular might actually be a little bit neutral bright in there, but that meant that the warmer, a little bit thicker, fuller and more rounded low end of the V281 was just the better sonic match to those headphones there, okay? So in both cases, like, you can back down the pre-gain if you're going to use, like, you just have to reach around on the back panel and flip the dip switches for the V281 to do it. But you can back off the pre-gain to make sure that you're not getting any hiss or noise floor seeping in to the headphone sound and all of that. But it's about synergistic pairings, I think, for low impedance dynamic driver headphones. And so it just comes down to your personal preferences, what you value. And of course, you know, there's the odd things that can happen, like the D1 and the 281 just not getting along, which is, I didn't expect, but you know, it happens sometimes. Okay, all that. So I mean, I say, so for easier driving stuff, be they planar loads or dynamic driver loads, it really gets less clear as to which one of these gets better. Okay, so what are my final takeaways here on which amp you should buy here? Again, both $2,800. Okay, they have different strengths. Like, what is the first question you need to answer is, what is your headphone collection like? What are you going to be plugging into these things? Because if it's a more difficult driving planar headphone, V324. If it's if it's a high impedance dynamic driver headphone, V281, those are just easy recommendations, you know. Okay, open, shut, that's the way to go if you're going to be prioritizing those kinds of loads there. In the middle, okay, that vast part of the world of headphones, it's in the middle. It's going to come down to personal preference. Okay, do you prefer the slightly warmer, thicker, more dynamic and punchy, slammy sound of the V281? Do you prefer the slightly more neutral, cleaner, clarity-focused sound of the V324? There is no right or wrong answer on that. It's just going to be what you are looking for in your sound there. Now, if you want the sound of the V281, but you want the planar drivability of the V324, you're either going to have to pony up for the Nimbus US5, or you're going to have to go with something like the HiFiMan Golden Wave Prelude amplifier, because that gives you like the warmth and the thickness and most of the dynamism and slam that the V281 gives you, but it drives those difficult driving planars like Susvara really well. That's about the only reason, though, that I would strongly recommend not getting one of these. Is just like if neither of the sounds that are described here seem right for you. But if the sounds seem right for you, it's really going to come down to first your headphone collection, and then if that is covered, then it's just about your preferences between these two, honestly. And I hope I've given you enough insight on the sound between these two that you can make a more informed choice as to which one is right for you. So, okay, thanks for watching, everyone. Yet again, this bonus video on the V324 here. Please remember to like, subscribe, comment, check out my PayPal and my Patreon. Generally do those things you do to support YouTube channels. Consider becoming a channel member, and as always, enjoy the music.